Hello there, good evening, and welcome to another edition of People's Platform. Well, Sri Lankans continue to face the brunt of the blow from the economic crisis, especially with the electricity tariffs being hiked up significantly again for the second time within the span of a very, very few months. Of course, the lead up to this electricity tariff hike was extremely dramatic. There is still a little bit more drama lingering on over the electricity tariff hike, including protests and open opposition from the chairman of the Public Utilities Commission, who has, well, taken it to a point where he's threatened to go to court over it. However, on the ground, electricity tariffs have been increased. Some people, although they say the electricity tariff is a 66% hike, some people have had their electricity bills jump up to 100% because of the other fixed rates that were adjusted along with the electricity tariff hike. But of course, to discuss these matters and much more, we've got with us here today Chayu Damsingha. He is the Product Head, Macroeconomic and Thematic Research at Frontier Research. A very good evening, Chayu, and welcome to the show.
Hi. Nice to be here.
Chayu, well, when this economic crisis began, our Hail Mary was the IMF. Initially, they said the IMF is coming all the way back in August, and that's when we were hopeful. That's when the fuel queues, gas queues, and power outages of about 15 hours per day were in existence in the country. Then that August deadline was pushed to somewhere around October. That went back to November, that went to December. From December, they were like, okay, maybe January. Now the president comes and says, we are receiving IMF support in March. What is your analysis of the situation?
So I think the earlier expectations, right, I think were those August, September points were mostly about the staff level agreement itself. So I think along those times it came out. Of course, there was some talk about it coming in June, July. I think realistically, the fact that it came, I think the end of August, 1st of September, essentially also when I think the documents were released for the staff level agreement. I think that's in line with what was probably going to happen. Since then, I think from that time, I know there were expectations, hopes, even expectations set that it could come, by the end of the year, before the end of the year even. Realistically, it would probably have taken until the end of December anyway, from the way things were looking at that point, because there were a lot of things that needed to be done. Specifically, one key thing would have been the budget being passed. So realistically, there would be no way for the IMF program to come in before the budget being passed. So that was anyway a bit of a deadline.
Because they needed to know where our priorities lied, how we were getting our money.
Essentially, the budget needed to be passed. The taxes needed to be increased.
Right.
And without that coming into play, the IMF couldn't really proceed with the program, because the fiscal part of the country would have just been an empty promise, right? After the budget became into law, at that point there's some sort of credibility that Sri Lanka is not going to be this deficit running country, because it's actually in law. Since then, the real hold-up has been these financing assurances that we've been wanting to get from our bilateral creditors, primarily the bilateral creditors. It's not, I've seen this idea around that, China, India, whoever needs to agree to a haircut. That's really not at play at all at this stage. What's really needed is for these countries, these bilateral creditors, to agree to these things called financing assurances, which is essentially for the period of the IMF program. They have to agree that they will not ask Sri Lanka to pay back their debt. That's essentially what is needed. And it has to be done in a way, the IMF calls it a specific and credible process, but there's also different other words. There has to be firm commitments, good prospect, lots of different vague words IMF uses. And that's really where this issue has come up, because previously for some other countries, China and India as well as some other countries, gave these financing assurances a lot more informally, right? There was some IMF officer who had explained that as friendly noises coming in from Chinese and Indian officials, right? Nothing written down on paper even.
Right.
Compared to that, of course, now we are seeing a lot more. But what happened in those countries, the idea was that those countries would tell to the IMF, look, trust us, we'll get it done. You can go ahead with the program. And the IMF was like, okay, we trust you, we'll go ahead with the program. They went with the program, but things didn't get done from the creditors.
So these countries, what countries are we talking about?
It was the issue is mostly with China and India, because the Paris Club of countries have already gone through. They have a process, they have a framework to deal with this debt restructuring because they've been through this before, especially in the 1980s, but even after that in the late 90s as well.
Right. So these countries that the IMF lent to on the promise that they will get things in order and didn't do so, what are those countries?
So I think the two main ones we can think of are Suriname and Zambia, an African country and a South American country. The issue was not that Suriname also had separate issues, but on the financing assurances side, is it that China and India said, we will give these countries proper financing assurances, trust us, but they didn't actually follow through on it, right? So, and that has hurt the IMF's credibility and the credibility of the entire process since then. And the IMF doesn't really want to take that same promise now from China and India, which is why the IMF requires more strong assurances, and which we saw with this Indian letter that was leaked as well, that India had provided to the IMF, providing financing assurances. I think that Indian letter was probably even more explicit than expected, very strong, very credible, because it gave very specific agreements, talked about IMF targets, like we will agree to even these targets kind of thing, which I don't think was expected at this stage anyway. Right, so it's from that point where India and then later the Paris Club gave very strong assurances, where what China has given seems lacking. And then, like we were chatting earlier, there are some other points where China is asking for kind of a different treatment of Chinese debt than all other debt. So that's also kind of coming into a little bit of it's not a Sri Lanka specific problem. It's a China I wouldn't say China versus, but China and the rest of the global debt restructuring, global sovereign debt problems. So that kind of problem is happening in the background, and Sri Lanka, as well as Zambia, as well as some other countries that might be coming up, Pakistan, for example, are kind of caught almost in the crossfire, because while the bigger powers are working out their problems, we are kind of stuck here waiting for the process to move forward, and we're not really seeing the process move forward.
Right. So, Chayu, now, like you said, now the Chinese debt. Sri Lanka is in this issue due to other reasons, also because of debt. We're looking for debt restructuring because our debt is not sustainable. Now, recently I saw Minister Bandula Gunawardena coming ahead and saying that they are in discussion with China for another Chinese-funded project, which will also be debt, for a similar LRT kind of public transport project with China. These were very vague statements that were made, but he said that they are in discussion with China for a Chinese-funded project like that. So at a time when Sri Lanka is facing such an issue with debt sustainability, how would you treat more debt or taking on more debt? Would you be extremely cautious? Would you not take on debt at all? Would you be extremely cautious? Or would you just, go how things were done in the past?
So I'm not opposed principally to the concept of debt, right? For a country to grow, most of the time you need debt, and even for cash flow reasons, you need some payments in the short term, you might need some debt. A lot of projects that if you want to implement, then most of the time they're going to be financed from abroad, because Sri Lanka doesn't really have the ability to generate magical dollars outside of our export revenue businesses, which include, of course, the tourism and the remittance side of it. But outside of that, there's really no way for Sri Lanka to generate extra dollars, especially if you need a sudden amount of dollars for a project. So you need to have it financed from elsewhere. So I think the problem with that kind of situation is not the debt in itself, but rather what it's used for. In the past, the biggest problem with Sri Lanka's debt, and I hear this question all the time, right? What happened to all these, billions of dollars we took in debt? Where is it? Did it get stashed somewhere? Did someone steal it? Right? Obviously, the charge is the Rajapaksa government stole it. We don't know what happened to the debt. That kind of question is there. That's not necessarily true. We have a very good idea what happened to the debt. We consumed it. A big chunk of Sri Lanka's debt requirements over the last 15 years has been for internal consumption. Directly and indirectly, they have been used to finance our imports. Right now, and then once you have built up a certain level of debt, now you also have to get more debt to pay off the previous debt. But most of the debt that we've taken has really been to bridge our current account deficit. So basically, we've imported more than we can pay for. We paid for that by borrowing some dollars on the open market, by getting it from other direct parties, whatever said and done. And then we are at a point where now we had to we've consumed a lot. In addition to that, there are specific projects that we have also borrowed for. For example, the Noracholi coal power plant was borrowed through a loan from China, and then that was how it was financed. There are different projects that were like our expressways were financed externally by different
The Nelum Bokuna, the Hambantota Port, the Mattala Airport.
Exactly. So things that were useful and things that were let's say, less useful for all finance through debt.
Not useful at all, you're missing that category.
I'm being a little polite in the way that I'm talking about it, but no. But I think, we need to think about that because these are very visible items, right? Let's say the port, the Lotus Tower, whatever. These are very visible items. We think, okay, this was where a lot of the debt was taken, but in fact, most of our debt was not for that. Most of our debt was taken for consumption, and therefore to pay off the debt taken for consumption for our current account deficit. That's been in the vicinity of $1 to $2 billion every year. We had a deficit on that side. So, you had to pay that away. That requires, a significant part of borrowings every year. And in fact, another part of what we've done with our debt and related to this, especially over the last 15 years, but since about 2005, this exacerbated.
With Sri Lanka graduating to a upper middle income,
Not really related to that, but it coincided, right? Where Sri Lanka started borrowing dollars and then using those borrowed dollars to control the exchange rate. To sell into the market to control the exchange rate. I did some rough numbers some time ago. It felt like from 2010 to 2019 or so, there might have been $6 to $7 billion alone just spent to control the exchange rate, right? That would have brought the average exchange rate, average depreciation down from a previous trajectory of about 7% annually down to about 5% or less. Of course, some years were more because you can't control that. But all of that is part of where our debt went, right? So if we are borrowing again anew, which we will have to for different reasons, what are we going to use it for? Are we going to use it for consumption? Are we going to use it to control the exchange rate artificially? Are we going to use it for specific projects? And if so, what are those projects going to be? Are they going to be useful projects? I think most people will agree the fact that the Newsfirst.lk power plant is here in Sri Lanka right now means that there is more availability of power. I think most people agree that on a balance of power, it's a good thing that we built that. But for example, the Lotus Tower, what's the point, right? I think a lot of people have those kinds of questions. So it's making sure what you borrow for is in the country's best interest. And for that, again, where does that come from? Who decides that? That's all a question. So that's, I think, about the overall power. It's about the bureaucrats who are there in addition to the politicians who make the decisions. So all of those parties really need to make good decisions. Debt in itself is not necessarily the problem. It's rather what you use the debt for.
Also, people are kind of up in arms about administrative costs, the expenses of the government. Technically, on a very simple way that people can understand, when people see, say a minister, for example, getting an allowance of, for 3 vehicles, fuel for 3 vehicles, 500 liters per month per vehicle, then they get a house, they get maids, they get free electricity, free power, telephone allowances, office allowances, staff allowances. When people see all of this, they sit back and wonder, hey, wait, I'm paying for all of that. Is that fair? How does this work out in setting up policy?
No, so I agree 100%. You look at that, that's unfair. It's ridiculous. It's a complete misallocation of resources. It's a terrible misallocation. I would argue it's even more of a misallocation of resources than people realize, because these numbers might not be that large, right? The amount, let's say you spend an individual MP, let's say, gets total benefits of, say, 5 million rupees a month. It's a lot, right? For an MP with 225 MPs, that's a lot, right? And then cabinet ministers would...
So you're allocating all the housing benefits, everything. The electricity, the vehicles, the fuel...
Let's say every month you spend 5 million, right?
To maintain an MP.
Everything, right?
Salary, everything.
Everything, 5 million a month. It's a lot. And that means a huge amount of things that come out of 5 million a month, right?
So that's about 120 or 225, yeah, that's 1,500.
That's a lot.
Over 1,000 million.
Right, let's say a billion.
Okay.
The Sri Lankan GDP this year is going to be 30 trillion, right? It's a tiny, tiny part of that. The point I'm making is not that it's just a small part so we can ignore it, right? The point is that, okay, we are making that kind of payment. It might not be that large, but the thing is, the government's overall expenditure is, compared to other peer countries, even in the South Asian region, is quite low. And that's a critical point I think a lot of people miss, that Sri Lanka's government is what we call a low-spend government. The problem is not that we spend so much, is that we spend so much in places where they should be spent and spend very little in places where we should spend, right? Just think about the education sector. How much do teachers get paid, right? that is, I think most people agree, is ridiculously low. Education is the bedrock of our society and our society's future. Teachers get paid ridiculously low amount. There's very little investment in R&D in Sri Lanka. It's almost nil. Even in the health sector, how many, like we have very small, a very few small number of doctors and nurses per capita, even compared to our peers. Again, because we don't really spend enough on those critical areas. We do have a system, and I try to explain through an analogy. It's not that we are on a bus and there are, the bus can hold 30 people, there are 200 people on the bus. The bus might have only 20 people, but they're all trying to sit in one seat. That's the problem that Sri Lanka's economy is in. And so therefore it's, yes, there's so much being spent on, let's say, ministers, so much being spent in places where we shouldn't spend. Whereas, and in order to do that, the rest of the government expenditure, things where we should spend on, is well below par, well below what we should spend. So a huge reallocation of that. So, I mean, it's bad enough that we're spending this, but we're spending this as a result, we're spending so little on so much more important things. So I think that massive reallocation has to happen and that's a critical part. That reallocation has to happen, of course, and then that's part of this whole question. In order to do that, we also need a little bit of tax revenue. But it's in the context of all that. There's a lot of unfairness, and that the extra expenditure that is done on things that don't matter, frankly, does need to cut down. It's not going to, in my view, do a lot to the finances of the country. But it is very important to improve trust in the system. It's very important to make sure that people recognize that the government is also, quote unquote, doing its part, even if it doesn't really move the needle on the finances. I think the government needs to. I think part of the reason these things don't happen is the government recognizes it doesn't move the needle that much. But I think the government also needs to recognize, and it's not just the government, and governments across the world, they don't really do too much on this because it doesn't move the needle that much. But that's not.
When you say
it
doesn't move the needle, what do you mean?
I mean, in terms of, let's say you cut all these costs by 50%, right?
So you reduce everything that the ministers get by half.
By half. Doesn't really. Okay, I'll put it in the context of the tax increases. It's really not. It might change your tax level from 24 to 23.8, right? It doesn't really change much of what's required. But it's still an important thing to do because it improves trust in the system. It shows that everyone's doing their part. I think not from a public trust perspective, building public confidence perspective, it's important for governments to do these things. Across the world, they usually don't because it doesn't matter to them financially. But I think they should realize that there's a huge social benefit of doing that and go ahead with it anyway.
So cutting these. But the issue really is that when a person looks at all of these massive spendings, now, for example, let's take the recent tax increases. Along with the tax increases, the government said that they will also tax non-cash benefits. And people saw that as a positive because a lot of people who get non-cash benefits are top state sector officials. Then the government goes ahead and slashes those taxes imposed on non-cash benefits because all of a sudden they realize, wait a second, parliamentarians, ministers and top government officials get paid very, very low salaries and they get massive amounts, maybe even 10 to 20 times their salary in non-cash benefits. And if they are to tax that, then the salary of the MP or the minister or the top-ranking government official is not going to cut it.
It goes negative, in fact.
It goes negative.
No, I agree. I think, okay, I mean, frankly, I think the solution there is raise the salaries and tax that more. That makes more sense than taxing non-cash benefits and not actually having cash flow to deal with it, right? You end up with the same benefit to the state and the same reduction. So you tax that level at an even higher tax rate, right? Not 24%, not 36%. You go even higher, for example, raise the salary and then tax a much higher top marginal tax rate. I think that's a more equitable way to go about it, and also allows for a very clear indication that this is actually being taxed. And it also doesn't mean, I mean, realistically, you can't have negative salaries for government officials. Like, that's also not realistic, right? There are people too, they need to do whatever, they need to survive. They need to survive, right? Maybe one could argue that, paying a loan off for a luxury apartment might not be something that's essential for a government servant. But I would argue that needing to survive obviously is, right? So like some basic level of obviously needs to basic level of payment obviously needs to happen. And one can also make the argument, and I see this argument, and I'm not going to get into that, but basically the idea that the more well paid you are, the less likely you are to engage in corruption. So consider all these arguments as well. But I think having the top marginal tax rate higher could have been a way to deal with that non-cash benefit problem a little bit more equitably. I agree, it wasn't very well handled at all. It's quite badly handled.
So Chayu, if I understood you correctly, you're saying that one thing, that a clear distinction or the lack of equity or unfairness that the people see is that people who necessarily steered the economy, who necessarily took the decisions that in the end resulted in the place that we are at today, are still getting huge benefits. They're not really feeling this taxes that were imposed. They are living it up while the people are paying for their sins. You're saying that putting a cap on their benefits, putting a cap on their allowances, whatnot, that's not really going to do much.
I think on the context of the scale of the financial problem that we're in my view, it very much stemmed from the fact that Sri Lanka as an economy overconsumed and financed that overconsumption through debt, mostly over the last 15 years, but also very much for decades before that at a lower level, unresolvingly as well.
Since the international markets opened up,
No, since the 50s. We've been doing this since the 50s, before that. Well before that. So since independence, we've been doing this, consuming more than we earn and financing that through debt. Until the mid-2000s, we could manage this through cheap debt because we were a low-income country, all of that. So there was some level of financing that came in. Of course, remember, during the 70s, we really cut down our imports by going full self-sufficiency, right? So that was also that's complete repression of the economic potential of the country by suppressing imports to that level, right? Like artificial suppression of imports, not letting things adjust. So you did have multiple instances of crisis in different ways. But of course, now you're at a point where I say there's no widespread electrification. We have a pretty vibrant 10 to 20% of the country as a middle class that grew up as a middle class, that knew their economy as a middle class. So the adjustment coming from this extent is different from an adjustment for a much, much poorer country, because you didn't necessarily have 100% of the country with electricity in the 50s, right? But now you do. And now at the cost, how much painful it is now is a lot worse than it would have been in the 50s. It would have been the 60s, 70s, 80s as well, right? So it's all of that. Again, on the original question, I don't think that adjusting the government's expenditure, especially these politicians' expenditure, is going to make much of a difference to the size of that problem, right? We're talking about trillions of rupees that versus maybe a few billions on that side, on that end, right? And again, we have a very good sense of what this money was used for, where this money went, what it was consumed for. There's enough data about that. It's not hidden, it's not stolen in that sense. That could have happened separately as a separate thing, but this massive quantity of consumption, there's a very good track record of it. That happened from the economy. So in a way, I also don't fully agree that we are only taking this pain for the mistakes of our leaders, but it's also for that the economy as a whole had come to a point, at least, let's put it, until the crisis, that it was built upon a foundation of this overconsumption, debt-driven consumption. But once you come to that point, once you start there, that's a self-perpetuating situation, right? Once, for example, let's say you borrow money and use it to control the exchange rate, it makes sense for you to bet on that continuing, right? You might be a perfectly honest person, not at all corrupt, perfectly honest. You might make sense for you to be an importer, because that's the cheap thing, that's the profitable thing to do in the economy. And now there's more people doing that, and all of these livelihoods are now dependent on being an importer, right? Does that mean importers were the cause of this crisis? No, it doesn't mean that. It definitely doesn't. It happened due to some other reason, but then it gets perpetuated by the fact that the economy as a whole makes a pretty rational decision that this is the profitable thing to do. And it goes into that. And this idea of this thing called the bezel, but essentially what it ultimately ends up meaning is that when the unsustainability of this whole process comes to the fore, you're in a situation where a lot of the economy, a lot of perfectly honest people who to the best of their knowledge, have done nothing wrong, are suddenly left hanging. And that's the situation we ended up in, right? It's not their fault, right? It might have been the fault at the very start of whoever started that process. And along the way, you also had different decisions taken that worsened this process, right? So all of those decisions have to be, people have to be held accountable for that. I mean, I'm not really seeing that happening. But, it's also the fact that the system in itself was in a very unsustainable economic system, right? So that's not something we can escape. The fact that the system itself was in this terrible
The base
state.
was faulty, the foundation was
Very
shaky, and because of that, now a house is crumbling. We'll come to a very interesting point, but we have to cross over to a short commercial break. We'll be right back after this. Stay tuned for more on the People's Platform.
Across all walks of life, listening to the people, visiting door to door, witnessing the truth firsthand. This is the heart of the village. Gammada. For the people, by the people.
Can people afford mistakes like the ones that your government is making?
No.
Then why should they choose you?
And it's important that the government leadership shows that the system works.
Do you see a viable alternative?
Don't you think that the focus should be on having a parliamentary election?
They want these people elected, now they have foot soldiers, that's all they care.
Face the Nation, Wednesday nights at 9:30 on TV1.
Self image. හැම කෙනාම තමන්ගේ වැඩේ හරියට කරා නම් අපි නැගිටිනවා.
බරපතල චෝදනාවක් තියෙනවා දුම්රිය දෙපාර්තමේන්තුවේ අතිකාල සඳහා විශාල මුදලක්.
පැහැදිලිවම ලංකාවේ අයිස් ප්‍රචලිත වුණා.
මේ කණ්ඩගෙන පත්තික ඒ පිගානට එන එක කඩින් හාල් කන කෙනාට තේරෙන්නේ නැහැ.
කව ආරම්භ වෙච්ච පොලිස් සංස්කෘතිය නෙමෙයි දැන් මේ වෙද්දි තියෙන්නේ. පුද්ගල පොලිසියට ආවට පස්සේ අපි යන්නේ ඔහුලකට.
සංචාරකයන්ට විකුණන්නේ ඔවුන්ගේ සිහින.
චර දේවල් ලැබුණත් මදි.
මට පෞද්ගලිකව දෙනවා නම් තපල් දෙපාර්තමේන්තුව මම දන්නවා ලාභ හොයන්න ඇති.
Welcome back to the People's Platform. We're in discussion with Chayu regarding, well, of course, the much talked about economy of Sri Lanka. Chayu, now, we find ourselves here in Sri Lanka in a very precarious situation. One, we're facing an economic crisis, the likes of which we've never, ever seen before. And on the top of that, we are being governed by a president, let's say, who was not elected by the people. The president who is currently in office failed to even secure his seat in parliament. He entered the parliament through the national list. And then we have a parliament with one party having a two-thirds majority, the president and prime minister of whom were chased away by the people of Sri Lanka. Now, we find ourselves in a fix of having to solve this economic crisis or solve the economic issues that you so very well explained that see their roots sprouting since the 1950s, with a president who does not have the trust of the people, with a parliament that had the trust of the people but has lost the trust of the people. So I don't know which the people distrust more, a president who didn't have the trust of the people from the beginning, or a parliament that had the trust and then blatantly violated and broke it. So against such a backdrop, now you're talking very, principally about setting up policies and doing what's right economically. How do you think the president and the parliament and the government of the day, current government of Sri Lanka, can achieve these economic targets when the people don't have their back, when the people are not backing it? Electricity tariff hikes, you said all of these are going to hurt. But a government that the people elected imposing, there's a difference between a government that the people have faith in imposing these tariffs and saying, look here, we are really facing an issue, we need to increase electricity tariffs, we won't increase it unless we have to, and the moment that we can reduce it, we will reduce it. There's a difference between a government that the people trust saying that and a government like the government of the day saying that. So how would you implement these policies, and how do you think it'll play out?
So I think in my view, the best time to have had an election was, say, August, September last year.
Last year?
Last year.
At the height of the issue?
No, the issue had started to settle down by then. Okay. The QR code started coming in late July, early August. Power cuts had come from about 13 hours in March to about 2 to 3 hours,
yeah.
Right? Roughly until very recently what we had as well.
Just a few days ago.
Exactly, right? I think that would have been a very good time, because that was when public sentiment was also most engaged with the process. People were also very civically engaged with what was happening in the country. And in terms of how the processes of the reform package is going, rather than starting part of the reform package and then going for an election and then trying to continue with the rest, I think it would have been far more legitimate for the reform process if before you even started the process, have an election, get a mandate for it, and then do the reform process. I think that would have been the best time. It would have been a risk, of course, but I think that would have been the least risky time to have an election, right?
But then, Chayu, I mean, you can't comment on that as an economist, right? Because people's emotions were high. Like how
always high, aren't they? That's the point of an election.
How do you? I mean, emotions high meaning, they're like, we vote for anyone but this government at the time, and
you can make that argument about any time, right? No. My point is, again, right now there's an election that's possibly going to happen, possibly not going to happen, possibly going to happen a little bit delayed. I am not going to comment, especially because we are in that process. Not going to comment about anything on that sort. But I mean, I will agree that what makes a reform package and a reform agenda successful is sticking to it, right? Sticking to the reform package, and part of what allows any government, the state of the country itself, to stick to an agenda like that. One, of course, is the ability to do so, right? Economically, financially, right? There might not be a lot of space for Sri Lanka to reverse from that, whatever anyone wants to come in and do. But even if you wanted to do it, regardless of what you want, what's your ability on a political economy front, right? And that's a question, right? So regardless, so is that legitimacy question and the trust question that you brought up, right? How can the government come up and say, do this, do that, do this, we are going to do all of this, whatever, you guys are going to do these things, but we're not necessarily representative, right? That question is there. I don't have an easy answer for that question, really, but I agree, like, legitimacy is a question. So in the context, right, of what we currently have right now, let's assume that before this election was going to happen, if there is a government that is, let's say, less elected less by the people, not elected by the people, lost its mandate, all of those questions, what such a government needs to do if there is no election coming up is to do things that regains the mandate of its people, right? So it's not about policy alone. Then it's also about dealing with these specific questions of trust, right? It doesn't matter whether the policy says it's not very useful to reduce these specific salaries necessarily. Do it anyway, because that's something that's required to regain the mandate of the people, right? Communicate what's happening. So I'll give one specific example here on this. There is this question about the CEB being restructured, right? And there's I think there's been, from what I understand, from what I see, from what I read, there's been a policy decision taken to restructure the CEB, whatever restructuring CEB means, right?
And privatize certain sectors of it.
Possibly, right? But that's the thing. I don't know. We don't really know, because the process, as far as we see, outside of the tariff increases, which is part of it, hasn't really moved forward, or at least we don't see it moving forward, right? So someone can very well look up and see, you said the CEB is going to be restructured. What has happened? Where's the progress on it, right? In reality, from what I think and what I see being reported, there is progress being made, but the progress is slow, possibly for legitimate reasons, possibly for completely not legitimate reasons. I, again, don't know what those reasons would be.
But the fact that you don't know is the issue.
That is the issue, right? One specific thing that could have been done was that I think sometime in October, November, there was this restructuring proposal that was presented to the ministry and then supposedly passed in, or at least accepted, tabled in cabinet as well, right? One thing that the government could do on this specific issue, publish that report, right? there might be some aspects of it you can't put publicly now due to commercial reasons, especially if you're talking about it. So redact those parts, make sure those parts are kept aside, but publish the rest of the report as much as you can. Show the people that there are steps being taken, and these steps are being taken in the people's best interest, right? So it's not just about the policy and doing the policy, but it's also very much about how that is communicated to the people. So it's not about what you do, it's about what people think you are doing. And that is the critical part that I think any government, regardless of whether they have the mandate to the people or not, has to really do, especially in contexts like Sri Lanka, where people have a history for decades, possibly longer, possibly shorter. Of course, people's memories change. At least right now, people think they have a memory of being swindled for decades, right? A few years ago, they didn't think that. 7 years ago, they didn't think that. 10 years ago, they didn't think that. But that's a different question altogether, right? So I think making sure that the people of the country are of the view that what the government is doing, however unpopular it is, are being done for the people's best interest. If you don't have a mandate, show to the people that you're doing what it takes to get that mandate back, right? That is not something I think the government seems to be doing that well.
And also with regard to the engagement of the people now, with the Aragale coming about and, the youth awakening in Sri Lanka, you said there was more civic involvement of the people. One thing is to include the people in these consultations, to include the people in these discussions. How important is it for, inclusive policy reforms to be made, and including the people in that discussion, because there are experts who would come and give their opinion, and there might be varying opinions, instead of just forcing a policy on the people. For example, best example being the organic fertilizer ban. The chemical fertilizer ban, and this whole thing around organic fertilizer. We saw very emotive statements. There were some parliamentarians who said, in Sinhala they said, "Me carbonica pohora gahuma bomb bag gahuwa wage hondata paladawak enawa," and all of that. While the experts were like, look, no, there is nothing to, back your claim. This entire food inflation, at this rate at least, could have been avoided if that inept decision was not taken. So when taking these decisions, how important is it to have public consultation? Now, I understand that not every member of the general public could be contributing positively or at least constructively to these discussions, but here in Sri Lanka, there seems to be no public consultation at all.
No, I agree 100%. So I think even if, and let's take the worst case, you do public consultation, you listen to no one you consulted, right?
Right.
Let's take that as the worst case.
Or you just do it for show.
You just do it for show. I still think that's a critical thing to do, because at the very least, you show that you're doing it, right?
Spending money on that is also fine with you, Chad.
I think, no, so this is the thing. Realistically, public consultations are about confidence building, in my view. I think that's the role that public consultations do. Realistically, you are not going to be able to get enough information from a public consultation unless it's really well done, that really changes the direction of a policy, right? Because, everyone, like someone makes a public consultation about me with something that I have a bias in, I will give a biased view because I have an incentive to give a specific view, right? You will have an incentive to give a specific view that helps you, right? That's true for everyone. That's not a wrong thing, but that's just the way, obviously, that people work. But I think public consultations are important because people, once you have public consultations, people feel that they're being listened to. People feel that their concerns are, if not 100% accepted, at least being, there is a recognition of those problems, right? And I think that is a critical part of public consultations that, governments, at least in this part of the world, don't really seem to do. I've noticed that in some African countries, they do a really good job of public consultations. Again, the policies themselves hold different question, but they have pretty robust public consultation process in some African countries,
right?
In some sub-Saharan African countries. So I think that public consultation process in that context is quite useful. I'll give one example where public consultation in Sri Lanka I think is done relatively well, and that is in specific legal, in the legal side, or when the central bank puts about legal kind of policies, right? Laws, legislation. There is a pretty robust public consultation process there. For example, they are recently putting out some Financial Consumer Regulations Act, there's been a public consultation process ongoing for quite some time. Obviously, by virtue of how it works, not everyone is going to be involved with that, but plenty of people are going to be involved with that. Plenty of stakeholders are going to be involved in that process. And that, especially because financial consumer regulations are going to be, very much a limited number of people directly involved in the way that those legislations work, you're going to have the people who are involved now having a little bit more confidence because they know that the central bank has talked to them a little bit at least, right? Now, whether the central bank listens to them is a completely other question. I genuinely don't know what the conversations in that situation, the whole thing was going, but the very fact that those consultations are ongoing, the very fact that that happens, I think breeds some level of confidence that this is not done purely behind closed doors. This is not done purely for someone else's interest. This is not done purely with some sort of vested interest of a politician or a bureaucrat, right? That there is something for the people. So constant communication, constant public consultation like that, I think is important, even if it doesn't mean anything else, just for the fact that people recognize that now they are being listened to. They are not being lied and hoodwinked. I think that is an important part of it.
Well, this secularism, at least in Sri Lanka, you said the Sri Lankan economy was closed down at certain points, and this whole mindset of us against the world, it's spread out to a point where even the state sector is very secular about their information. They always hold it back. The right to information was supposed to encourage proactive disclosure, but seems as if it has only encouraged more, of course, legally. When they are bound to disclose information, there are instances where information is disclosed, but there are many instances where false reasons such as public defense, public security, and all of that is cited just to protect that bit of information. Proactive disclosure of information. How much do you think this is important moving forward and implementing the right policies and building public confidence?
From an economics point of view, I have found the right to information Act very useful. A lot of information that has come into the public eye through some different people's application of the RTI Act, and as a result there has been some proactive disclosure of some types of data in some institutes. And I agree 100% that hasn't happened everywhere. Majority of places that hasn't happened. But purely from an economics point of view, I will say that having access to more data, having access to more statistics, having access to more information is critical. It's critical for people to understand what's going on. It's critical for people to, even for people who make policy recommendations, recognize what's actually going on. If you're making those recommendations from outside, now you have more information that you can base your recommendations on. People who are just working, let's say in the private sector, you have more understanding what's actually going on with some parts of the economy, with some parts of the country that you otherwise would not have access to. So I think the presence of more and more information in the system is a critical thing, especially economically. I think it's very useful for people, especially because once that information comes out in the public space, more and more people are going to use it. More and more people are going to base knowledge off of it. So you don't necessarily need to go have analysts going and finding that information and just doing something on their own, but you also have a lot of work being done outside of it, a lot of people having access to the fruits of that information, the knowledge, whatever is based upon that, right? So yes, I think having proactive disclosure of information is quite critical. I think there are good places where there is a lot of information that is out there. Of course, a lot of places where there isn't, and that dichotomy is very, very visible, especially when you look at different parts. For example, the SOEs, very little disclosure. Some state institutions, again, the finance ministry, the central bank, quite a lot of economic data because that's something I work with. I see there's a lot of information out there in those contexts. Some institutes, like for example the cabinet office, a lot of information is there. You'll have to RTI it. There are lots of other institutes, SOEs, where, like you said, even RTIs don't really practically work.
Thank you very much, Chayu Damsingh, for joining us on our program and explaining, of course, these very complicated economic matters and moving forward, implementing proper policies here in Sri Lanka in a language that all people can understand. Of course, people who are not specified or professionals in the field of economics. Thank you very much, Chayu, for coming on our show, and thank you very much once again to all our viewers out there. In the previous few programs, of course, I requested our viewers to vote wise, but given the current situation in the country, we are unsure as to even if we will get a chance to voice our opinions or vote before the due date for the election that has been set by law. But we can do the right thing. Like Charlie mentioned, we've been doing quite a lot of wrong things over the past, stemming from the base of our economy. But move forward as a country, we need to change at some point. And what better time than now? Until we meet again, take care. God bless.